my name is Irene, and in this video we are going to talk about how we can use reference planes and work planes to model complex geometry when we are creating model in place components. So let's get to it. Alright, so I'm starting with the same setup that I mentioned back on my first video on model in place components. I have my 3D view and I have my floor plan view. And if you saw my previous video about the creation tools, you may have noticed that I mentioned the fact that I was modeling everything on the floor. And basically what this is going to do is create this limitation where basically everything that you make is kind of like locked on the floor. So I'm just going to model here quickly a rectangle just to demonstrate again. So if I say yes here, make it a little bit taller. There you go. And if I say yes, everything looks fine. Like in my floor plan view, I can move this guy anywhere that I want. But for example, if I go to my, let's say to my south elevation, you're going to notice that I cannot move this guy up and down. It's kind of like locked on the floor. So this is because something that is super important to Revit, and that it basically exists with most 3D modeling software, is just that most 3D modeling software kind of hides these concepts, and Revit makes it very like integral to the modeling process. But with most 3D modeling softwares, you are always working in a work plane, basically a surface upon which you are modeling your objects. The best way that I find to explain these to people is if you have ever been involved or seen or participated with 3D printing, it works just like 3D printing. So if you've ever seen a 3D printer, you basically have a plate or like a resin tray, whichever one it is, and basically your thing gets modeled from that surface. But you cannot make a 3D model that, like if the 3D printer is here on the top, it's not going to extrude like something like this in the air. It can only work from that base trace, sculpting upwards, okay? So basically you can think about your work planes in Revit as these 3D printing surface. Like you always have to start in the surface, and then from the surface, you can start doing edits. Like technically speaking, I could break away from the limitation of my floor by selecting this and manually dragging it. And you may be like, oh, see, now it's no longer touching the floor. But what's going to happen is that it is still, see, it's still restricted to that position. We've just changed the general height in relationship to it. So you have to be really careful with this, because this is one of those things that I was mentioning back in my first video, that sometimes you're not going to be able to copy a component from one project to another. The main reason that you get that limitation is because of the work plane. And the other very important thing to understand is that you don't always have to model things from the floor. So now we're going to see how work planes work. I'm going to start very easy, and then we're going to build complexity, okay? So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to reveal here what is the work plane of the geometry that we're working with. And the way that we do that is by going to the Create tab, and you're going to see that here all the way at the end on the right side, you're going to have these work plane options. So you can set a work plane. You actually have a couple of options here, and you can show a work plane. You also have this viewer here, which is going to basically open this additional window. I don't find that super helpful, but you know, thanks Revit. So instead, what I recommend is to show your work plane. So this is basically going to highlight the surface from which you are modeling. So see, if I turn this on, it's telling me it's the floor. You're drawing on the floor, okay? It gives you a little grid. The grid doesn't do much, but you know, thanks again, Revit. So personally, I find having the work plane on all the time annoying. I find it kind of gets in my way of modeling, but I do like it very much as a turn it on, turn it off tool. So if I just want to verify that things are going correctly, I can check on this. So I'm going to turn it off temporarily, and I'm going to delete this guy. So thing number one, how can I change my work plane if I don't want it to be on the floor? Well, let's say that if I don't want it to be on level 1, I could want it to be on level 2. So the same way that when we were doing our floor and our ceiling and our roof, what level we are on determines where that floor, ceiling, or roof goes. Same thing is going to happen here with the geometry that we create. So everything that we created was on level 1 because we were drawing it in the level 1 view. But look what's going to happen now if I do the same thing, but on level 2. So if I come here and I say, okay, you're going to be there, and I say yes. Now you're going to notice if I go here and I go to my front view, see, this guy starts at level 2 and it is locked at level 2. So whatever level you draw on, that's going to be your lock. And again, if you are uncertain of where your work plane is, you can just come here and turn it on. And you can see here, oh, this is the default. Sorry, the one that I was working there. If I go there and I turn that on, there you go. See, that one is on level 2. So that's another thing that is important. You may notice that my work plane is level 1. So in my case here, what I did is that if you go to a specific view and then you model your geometry, you are making that specific geometry that you modeled lock to that level. But the work plane of the component as a whole is still going to be by default the floor. If you want to change the work plane of the geometry of the model in place component as a whole, then you can do that. Let me put it here so we can see it a little bit better. You can do that without having to create any geometry. You can go back to your create tab. You can come here and you can say that you want to set the work plane. And when you click on that, you're going to get this window here. And you're going to see that you actually come with a few like pre-made options based on your levels. So if I say, no, my work plane for this model in place component is going to be level 2. See how it changed it there? And now my default work plane for this model in place component is level 2. Personally, I don't find that very helpful unless I am modeling, let's say, some ceiling geometry. But basically, your levels are always going to be the default. You may also notice that you have the options of picking a plane. So we're going to see those in a second. So now let's say that I don't want my work plane to be level 1 or level 2. I don't want it to be horizontal. Let's say that I want my work plane to be vertical. So far what we have been doing is we went to level 1 to work in that work plane and we went to level 2 to work on that work plane. So what if we go to like an elevated view such as south, east, northwest to draw in elevation, so to speak. Okay, cool. I'm going to go here to extrusion and it's going to tell me that I have to pick a plane and it's only going to give me those 2 levels. So this is the limitation. If you are working just with what the project gave you, you can only work with levels as your work planes. That's it. That's your only option. I mean, it's not. There are many more options, but by default with your project, levels are the only work planes. So here's where things get interesting. Because if you do not want to work with the work planes that come by default with your project, you can create your own. So to create your own work planes, you are going to create a reference plane. So a reference plane is basically a work plane that goes in any direction that you want it to. So for example, I can come here and say, okay, I'm going to draw a reference plane. Now, what you want to understand when you're drawing a reference plane, because when we preview a reference plane, we always preview it as a rectangle. And that might make you think that you are going to draw a rectangle. You are not drawing a rectangle. You are drawing an axis that then it becomes your plane. So in my level 1 here, so if I want the vertical plane, I have to draw it in like a horizontal position. So if I come here and I draw, let's say I'm going to draw a line here. See, this is going to be my new plane. I'm going to give it a name. I'm just going to call it 1 so we can find it. Okay. So again, right now we are seeing the work plane that is my level 1. Yes. But now I have this guy here. So now what's going to happen when I go to my south elevation and I go and I say that I want to make an extrusion, when I go to pick a plane, I can come here and say I want it to be reference plane 1. And when I say yes, and I say, okay, let's turn it on so we can see it. There you go. See? So now this is a vertical surface. And I can come here and let's say I'm going to draw something like that. I don't know. Yes. And see? So now this guy, again, remember what we're viewing here is the default work plane. So see, now this guy is vertical. And the important thing to understand is that this guy, see, there is my reference plane and this guy is starting at the reference plane. So the important thing here to understand is that this guy is locked to this reference plane. That means that I can move it, like if I'm in my south elevation, see, this guy can move freely up and down and all around. I don't have a limit there. But if I go to my floor plan, oops, I moved it too high. Let me move it down. There you go. But if I go to my floor plan here and I try to move it away, it's locked. See? So your geometry is always going to be locked to the work plane in which you created it. And this is where you can have trouble with Revit because, for example, you can have a model in place component that has multiple work planes. So see, for example, this guy is attached to this work plane, and then I'm going to make this other rectangle, which is going to be attached to my level 1 work plane, right? So see, something like this. And what's going to happen here when I finish this model is that this guy is going to give me a lot of trouble to move it because if I come here, I can move it there. Sure, I can move it there. And then what's going to happen? Oh, it has locked. Why is it locked on the floor? Because remember, we have the general work plane of my floor. So like, again, remember, you have the work plane while you are creating each geometry, but then you have the overall work plane of the model in place component. So that work plane will override any work plane for the individual geometries. But then if I want to change the individual geometries, I may get some other specific error. So keep that into consideration. You can have a gazillion work planes. This is particularly helpful if you have something that is completely detached. Also keep in mind that work planes don't need to be aligned with your XYZ. You can have a reference plane that is at an odd angle. That's perfectly fine. But keep in mind the one limitation of work planes is the fact that they can only be straight lines. You cannot have a work plane that is a curve. Okay, so I could come here and say, okay, now I want to create, see, this is when, especially if you have a work plane that is at an angle, it might be easier to model it in the 3D view. So for example, if I come here and I do a revolve, I can come here and I can set my work plane, see, and I can come here and say that it's going to be reference plane 2, and then okay. And then again, if you're confused about what the hell is going on, you can go to show, and that's where my work plane is. And then I can model my geometry. So let's say that this guy is going to be a skinny little rectangle like this, and then my axis is gonna be something like that, and then I can say yes, and there you go, we have that cylinder, except that the cylinder, I can say that it's 180, something like that, right? Pretty cool stuff. See how it relates to the work plane? So work planes are super important in Revit. Now, you may be looking at this and be like, Irene, this is all cool and great and awesome, but I don't like it. This feels very stiff. I don't want to have to think about the individual geometry and each work plane, because as you can see, your objects are locked to that work plane. Technically speaking, moving the work plane will allow you to move the object, but again, that can be kind of annoying. So you might be, Irene, is there an easier way to do this? Like having to create a new work plane every time that I want to model something sounds absurdly annoying. Is there a better way? And the answer is yes. Once you have geometry in your model, and now you're going to see why I like to have the 3D view. Once you have a geometry in your model, any surface, as long as it's straight, can become a work plane. So check it out. If I have this geometry and I want to add more details to it, what I can do is say that I want to pick a plane. And what this is going to do is allow me to select any surface as long as the surface is flat. So again, the only exception to this will be, escape. The only exception to this will be curves. See, this curved surface here, it's not gonna recognize it. The top of the cylinder, of course. The bottom of the cylinder, no problem. But the cylinder, the curve itself, not allowed. Okay, so you can pick a surface and then you can model directly in that surface. So let's say that I can come here and I want to do a sweep and I'm going to sketch my 2D path. So this is why I'm not super bothered by the fact that when you're drawing the path on a sweep, it has to be 2D, because as long as you can pick your path, technically speaking, it's not that big of a problem. Again, as long as like you only want it to go in a direction. If you want it to follow the geometry, then you pick the path, right? So we're going to go to our profile. We're going to edit. I'm going to draw. I think I'm going to do just like a simple little circle like this. And I'm going to say yes. And I'm going to say yes. And look at that. Beautiful, crazy stuff. I can turn off my profile like that. See? So as you can see, the only problem of working with these work planes is that it can make it a little bit difficult to make copies of things if the work planes are not perfectly aligned. So for example, if I select this guy and I go and I say, okay, I want to copy it from this corner to this corner. Initially, it may look like it all worked correctly, but you can see that it did not really understood what I wanted it to do. So if this is the case, like you want to have the same guy that you have here, you want to have it here, I find that it's much easier to basically copy to a new work plane. So what do I mean with that? So what you're going to do is you're going to select your guy and you're going to go Control-C or copy, right? Copy to clipboard. And then what you can do is you can say, okay, so I'm going to set a new work plane by picking and say this surface. So now we're working. Oh, no, it moved it. Wait, one step at a time. I'm going to copy it to clipboard and then I'm going to come here and I'm going to go paste and I can say align to same place. Don't worry. Right now, that means that they're overlapping. So basically, if I delete one, there's still another one. So I'm going to do that because what I can do is I can select this new guy and I can say that I want to give it a new work plane. So you don't always have to come to create, set, pick a plane. You could have something selected and say I just wanted to have a new work plane. And see, you can choose either a work plane, so level 1, level 2, or this 1 and 2 that we selected, or a face. And then for the face, oh, Jesus Christ. Oh, Revit, please don't explode. There. Ooh, that was a little bit scary. And then I can manually move it to whatever I want it to be. Or, oops, the other way that you could do it, let me see. So I can select my geometry and I can come here to create, set, pick my plane, and then I can say, no, I wanted it to be here. See? And then it's going to put it exactly in the same place, but in a new plane. So as you can see, like you can do really complex stuff when working with work planes. And this is usually my favorite way of working. Because if you think about, like, I'm going to give a couple of examples from the top of my head. If you're doing cabinetry, let's say that you're doing a kitchen. Usually you're thinking about the kitchen in floor plan, so you're extruding it. And then from there, you're building the details in the front, right? So whether it's doors, drawers, trims, whatnot, you start with an extrusion and then you're working in the front of that cabinet. If you're doing shelving, for example, you may be starting in an elevation. So you're starting in that like wall, so to speak, and you're extruding out of that wall. And then you're adding like molding and trimming and whatever to that surface. So most geometries that you're going to encounter in interior design, it's much easier if you start with a shape and then you start picking the faces of that shape to add your additional details, whether those details are additions or subtraction. But as you can see, the work plane is really going to become an essential part in making sure that your geometry has the shape that you want it to have. Another very important thing is that you may notice that you can actually delete work planes. You only need the work plane while you are creating the geometry, but keep in mind that if you delete a work plane and then you later want to put something else in that same work plane, that work plane is no longer going to be available for you. So just keep that into consideration. Personally, I find that there's nothing wrong with leaving your work planes because they are not visible in the project, right? Like when I'm done doing my model and I click here on Finish Model, you can see that the work plane completely disappears. So there's no reason for you to delete them. I would not recommend that you do so. But with that, we have reached the end of this video. I hope you find that helpful. If you have any questions, by all means, feel free to ask. But otherwise, thank you very much for joining in. Thank you very much for sticking through, and I will see you in the next one. Have a good one. Bye.